Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes here today. I hope everybody is safe and healthy and that your families are well. I did want to spend a minute today talking to you about two new measures that I'm calling for to fully address the increased threats of domestic terrorism in the United States, including doubling the penalty for insurrection against our country and urging the new administration to reinstate the Department of Homeland Security office focused on combating homegrown violent terrorism and extremism. 2 weeks ago, the world witnessed a deadly attack on the US Capitol, cited to overturn our democracy and the will of the American people. I'm here today because with the new Congress in place and with the new administration in the White House, we must redouble our efforts to prioritize the serious threat of domestic terrorism in our nation, as well as taking on our continued effort against ISIS-inspired homegrown lone wolf terrorism. The stats are clear. 2019 was the deadliest year for domestic terrorism since Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, anti-Semitic incidents and overall hate and bias incidents were at an all-time high in their report last year. Also in New Jersey last year, our state's Office of Homeland Security Preparedness increased the threat posed by white supremacist extremists from moderate to high, joining homegrown violent extremists as the most persistent hostile actor in the state of New Jersey. Again, in New Jersey last year, our state Office of Homeland Security increased the threat posed by white supremacist extremists from moderate to high, joining homegrown violent extremists like ISIS-inspired terrorists as the most persistent hostile actors in New Jersey. Just 2 weeks ago, as you all know, we witnessed an attack on our Capitol, a breach of our Capitol, and on our democracy, when violent rioters invaded the Capitol in a failed insurrection, purportedly in the name of overturning an election. It turns out that lawless thugs included known violent extremist groups like the Stop the Steal effort, Oath Keepers and Three Percenters, Proud Boys, and many others attempted this insurrection. Democracy won out at the end of the day, and the violent extremists failed. As President Biden said in his inaugural address just this week, we have, quote, a rise in political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and that we will defeat. He went on to say, quote, a riotous mob thought they could use violence to silence the will of the people, to stop the work of our democracy, and to drive us from this sacred ground. That obviously did not happen. It will never happen, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. I couldn't agree more with the president. What happens on January 6th with the breach of the Capitol, with members like myself told to wear gas masks and duck under the chairs, under the seats in the House chamber, cannot and must not ever happen again in our country. We must protect our homeland, our families, and our communities, all that we hold dear. I plan to help lead that fight with my new appointment to the Homeland Security Committee and to work with others to do so. We can all clearly see what harms these threats of domestic terrorism and extremism can do to our democracy, and we must fight back and fight back strong. That's why today I'm introducing new legislation. I'll be introducing new legislation, and that's why I'm announcing it today, to double the maximum jail sentence penalties for a conviction of insurrection against the United States from 10 to 20 years. Again, today, I'm announcing that I'll be introducing new legislation to double the maximum jail sentence penalties for conviction of insurrection against the United States from 10 to 20 years. If you attempt to overturn and overrun our democracy through violence or uprising, you will pay the price. We are not a land of lawless thugs, and you attempt to overthrow it through violence, you will pay the price. I'm also urging the new administration to tackle the growing white supremacist threat with a comprehensive, all-encompassing strategy to counter violent extremism, or CVE. This is an effort that I focused on this past Congress and introduced legislation on to tackle white supremacists. This builds on that. Under the Obama-Biden administration, the Office of Community Partnerships, OCP, was specifically established as a designated lead on efforts to counter violent extremism. This office was within the Department of Homeland Security, which our House Homeland Security Committee oversees. However, beginning in 2017, the previous administration, Trump administration, reorganized the office, deprioritizing critical support for efforts to counter the domestic far-right white supremacist extremists, as well as ISIS-inspired lone wolf terrorists, both threats. And yet, what we have seen in recent months is clear: an increase in violent extremism here on our doorstep, in the backyards of our communities, threatening our American way of life and our democracy. The attack on the Capitol, of course, was another dot in the tapestry of years of increased violence against and threats against the United States. We cannot and will not let this stand. So today, Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick and I are leading a bipartisan letter to the new administration, urging them to restore the Office of Community Partnerships within the Department of Homeland Security and fully confront the threat of domestic terrorism and violent extremism, including white supremacy. Robust federal support for community partnerships is a critical part of the full spectrum of efforts to thwart radicalization, provide off-ramps for would-be extremists, prevent violence, and stop terrorism, including ISIS-inspired homegrown lone wolf terrorists. Now, it isn't just that. We must do more. Let's boost resources for countering terrorism and homegrown violent extremist prevention, including CVE grants, so that we can work to address radicalization, renew our national strategy specifically dedicated to countering domestic terrorism and far-right extremism, and create a centralized office within the Department of Homeland Security, just like the CIA has to fight global terror, to coordinate all of our domestic terrorism prevention efforts. It just makes sense. It should be centralized. It should be coordinated, so we never allow an attack to occur again, like the one on January 6th. It's my hope the new administration will fully consider this request. It's also my hope that working closely with President Biden and his team and my colleagues on the House Homeland Security Committee and across the aisle, including with my colleagues in the Senate, we can create bipartisan solutions to combat these growing threats. There is nothing partisan about fighting insurrectionists. There's nothing partisan about stopping terrorists on our homeland and threats to our homeland. This is just about red, white, and blue. It's about standing for our country first and protecting our country and our democracy. My announcement today builds on my efforts over the years to combat lone wolf and homegrown terrorism and white supremacy, which includes my bipartisan freezing assets of suspected terrorists and enemy recruits, or the FASTER Act, for law enforcement to be able to freeze the assets of all domestic terrorists when a suspect is under federal arrest. It also implements a one-of-a-kind national homegrown terrorism incident clearinghouse for all levels of law enforcement to collect and share information on homegrown lone wolf terrorism and violent extremism to help investigate and thwart future attacks. I've also, with the Darren Drake legislation that I've introduced to help stop the latest weapons of terror in the United States, where we know that terrorists, as they did against Darren Drake and others in New York, are using vehicles, trucks, as weapons of terror. Our legislation that we've introduced will stop those terrorists by requiring background checks before renting a truck or similar vehicle. We have to stay steps ahead of those who threaten our homeland and threaten our country. I also introduced last year the Online Terrorism Prevention Act to require regular disclosure of designated foreign terrorist organizations on social media, and to impose financial and criminal penalties for social media companies that fail to eliminate terrorist content from their platforms, as some have failed to do on allowing organizations, terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others to literally have handles on Twitter, and to promote their content on social media and to recruit and threaten the United States of America and our allies. That must not be allowed. By combating all these threats with the Homeland Security Committee and the new administration, all of us working together in a bipartisan manner, with new legislation and with the CVE office back in gear, I hope, at DHS to fully safeguard our nation, I know that here in the greatest country in the entire world, our best days will always be ahead of us. Thank you for tuning in, and may God continue to bless your families, watch over our troops who are in harm's way, protect our brave first responders here at home, and to make sure that our best days will always be ahead, as I said, in the greatest country in the entire world. Thank you, and may God bless our country.